home ownership, what we do, we produce that widget. We manufacture mortgage loans, and our industry, our staffing levels are off nearly half of where they were 18 months ago. Mortgage applications are at their lowest levels since 1996. Mortgage payments are up over 100% for buyers who can actually find a home. So, we have all the issues around rates, but then we have inventory. So there are a lot of things going on that impact our industry. And as we look at it, the Fed has this blunt tool to check inflation. And it, in essence, at the end of the day, it may place a whole generation of homeowners on the sidelines. So when we think about what that means to homeownership and not just our industry, but how does the Fed weigh all of these countervailing impacts of their policymaking?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's one that I think we've kind of seen come up over and over again over sort of history of this institution. So the Fed has been an inflation fighter, kind of not from inception, but from relatively early in its historical timeline. This was something that it had really embraced by at least the 1950s. And so we've seen these cycles where the Fed tries to cool off the economy, as you kind of alluded to, very heavily through the housing market. Like that is how these policies work. They make mortgages more expensive, they make car loans more expensive, leases, business loans, all the whole kit and caboodle. But obviously, the mortgage market is a really crucial mechanism through which all of those policies work. And so this has long been the way that policy has worked. I think we saw it used most aggressively to fight inflation and to really cool off the economy in the late 1970s, early 1980s episode. So the Volcker disinflation, which I'm sure, given the industry that you are all in, you are all very highly familiar with.
We are.
Paul Volcker pushed interest rates up well into double digit levels. Super painful period for the economy, hugely painful recession that tossed a lot of people out of work. Um, in that episode, actually, builders were mailing Paul Volcker two by fours from all the houses they couldn't build. It was a very historically painful period, and so I think we've clearly seen this conversation over and over again. What does it cost to try and control the economy this way? And I think that the answer that Paul Volcker came up with, and the answer that I think you still hear today when you talk to Fed officials, is it costs a lot. It's a really unpleasant process, but from a macroeconomic perspective, from a monetary policy perspective, this is kind of the only way we figured out to do it. The Fed has one tool. It's main interest policy interest rate, the Fed funds rate. It's a blunt tool. It does work in kind of a painful way. It's expensive to borrow to do just about anything. Um, and that is, while it's can be a pretty unfortunate situation, they haven't figured out a better alternative. Basically, is the long and short of it. And so I think that if you ask Fed officials, they'll tell you that the real alternative is basically to do nothing here, and they think that that would be worse for the economy in the longer run. They basically make the argument that if you just sort of leave interest rates super low, allow the housing market and the rest of the economy to continue to chug along, the decision you're essentially making there is to allow inflation to become a more permanent part of the economy. In a world where we have higher inflation, there's a risk that it begins to feed on itself, that it just kind of ratchets endlessly higher, and that's really destabilizing. Nobody wants to be a hyperinflationary country. Hyperinflation has never really been an issue in the US in the modern era, but we clearly are capable of achieving dangerously high levels of inflation, which I think the early 1980s showed us. And so we just don't want to get back into that world. And so I think that is very much how the Fed thinks about it. It thinks if you act early, if you act responsibly, quickly, you can, with some pain, manage to control this problem. If you wait, it might get a lot worse, and then it's going to be a lot more painful to control.